Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. Great to have you all here for our talk today. I'm joining you from Stratford. I'm on my way to the Tree Musketeers event, so it's a lovely day, and it's great to be out actually visiting some of the Tree Festival events this year. Our speaker today is Sitara Garo. She's joining us from Brisbane in Queensland, and she's an arborist and urban forester who's worked in the industry for 20 years. So she's going to be talking today about genetic characteristics, amongst other things. And she's asked me from the beginning to ask you guys if you have any questions, if you could please add them in the chat, and she'll get to those later on. Also, obviously, we're in an open Zoom room, so if you could all remain on mute, we'd really appreciate that, and put your hand up if you need to speak. So I'll hand over to Sitara, and thanks very much for joining us, and great to have you with us.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody, for coming today and taking time out of your Friday and your lunch, and it's evening here, and so I'm just going to start. I'll share my screen, and I'm just going to start with that. And just 1 minute. I'll just move that to the side. So thanks once again. I just want to start by acknowledging the country that I'm on here in Brisbane, Queensland. I'm living on the Turrbal people, the land of the Turrbal people, on the north side of Brisbane. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Turrbal people on the south side of Brisbane. And I would, I'm going to start actually with a poem, because it's pretty apt poem for talking about trees in the city, and it's by Ujiri Noonuckle, and it's called Municipal Gum. And okay, so gum tree in the city street, hard bitumen around your feet, rather you should be in the cool world of leafy forest halls and wild bird calls. Here you seem to me like that poor cart horse, castrated, broken, a thing wronged, strapped and buckled, its hell prolonged, whose hung head and listless mine express its hopelessness. Municipal gum, it is dolorous to see you thus, set in your black grass of bitumen, O fellow citizen, what have they done to us? I think that poem really sets the tone for what I'm going to be talking about today. And because most of my experience has been with city trees, the outline of today is really, I'm going to be talking about the benefits of urban trees. I'm going to be talking about defects and difference, because there's been a lot of talk about that in the arboriculture industry. I'm going to talk about structure and health of trees, trees and stress, and how do we become more tree wise. Essentially, I started to run these workshops. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself. Essentially, I started to run these workshops because I noticed that a lot of the public and generally people didn't have a lot of knowledge about how trees grew and what they needed. And I just wanted to really give basic workshops on arboriculture knowledge. And so I've been doing these workshops for about 5 years. I've been doing them at different community nurseries, and last weekend I did 2 days of workshops at a wood expo that was run by a rewilding group, and that are into sustainable woodworking. And so I've been running these groups with this with tree health in mind, tree pruning, and talking about the language of trees. And so I'm just going to oh, sorry, I'm just going to go back and just go to here. Sorry about that. We were just trying to work out about the notes. So I guess I want to start with the benefits of trees in the city and how much they offer us in improving our air quality, improving water quality through reduced storm water runoff, improving the shade within the city, reducing the effects of the heat island effect with all of the concrete and asphalt as cities become a lot more developed, and also all the carbon and sequestration by the trees and habitat value for urban wildlife. And basically there has been just so much research done in the last, I would say 15 to 20 years. It's really ramped up about the benefits of trees in the city for our mental well-being. It's really impacted us after COVID. There's been so much money put into local parks because parks became the hub of people's social outings. And so there's been a lot more focus put on the environment within the city to improve green infrastructure. And the aesthetic, I mean, we know about the aesthetic benefits of trees and how people will spend much more time in an area with trees, doing their shopping, spending time outside with friends. And also trees block noise, they block unwanted views, and they also, I mean, they also increase property values by between 3 to 8%. If you have a standalone single tree, a major feature tree at the front of your property, it will increase your price to up to 8%. Yeah, and so green cities are abundant cities and improve the well-being of residents and visitors. And so now that we all are aware of that, what I'm wanting to do is tell people or explain to people about how to read the language of trees and becoming more tree wise. And so Klaus Madik, one of the forefathers of modern arboriculture, he wrote The Body Language of Trees, and he's still alive. I think he's just had his last few workshops in the last couple of years. And he also wrote Stuxi Explains the Tree, A Hedgehog Teaches the Body Language of Trees. And so that model that he developed through that book was essentially a way for arborists to undertake a visual tree assessment. But what I've been doing I've been extending that so that everyday people can learn about trees and learn about characteristics of trees and understanding why trees have grown in particular ways and why they have different characteristics. And so in doing that, I've been thinking about extending his visual tree assessment to more of a way of reading the tree story. And so essentially, I've split it up into 3 different areas. I've split it up into genetic characteristics that are for the species. And I've split it up to the environment and also to the events of a tree's life. And those 3 things, if we learn about the characteristics within those 3 areas, we can improve our understanding of what the tree's trying to tell us. And so through its growth patterns, how it's responding to different events, and whether or not some of those things are typical for its species or not typical. And so that's really what I want to talk about today, is about those things. And in doing so, I want to name, I guess, an elephant in the room, in that when I'm talking about characteristics, some of these things have once been considered defects and would now still be considered defects. But within arboriculture, we're moving away from that terminology because it has a negative bias. And when we're talking with the public, who are increasingly concerned about litigation, insurance, risk, with using the terminology of defect isn't actually helpful. And so that's why I've started to talk about characteristics and difference rather than dysfunction, because something may have a characteristic that's different, but it may not mean at all that the tree's at a high likelihood of failure. And so essentially with this workshop, if there's things that you see after this workshop that are of concern to you, you must always seek professional advice, because these characteristics in themselves do not necessarily mean that the tree's at a higher risk. There's a lot of other things that happen with trees, and there's a lot of environmental conditions, and those things impact whether or not something may be at risk. And so what I would recommend is always to have a tree looked at by a professional arborist. And because defects doesn't mean failure. It doesn't mean that something is definitely going to fail. There is always a may, and it may be under, we always talk about normal weather events and extreme weather events, or just normal storm events. In Brisbane, we have a storm season that lasts from essentially the end of October till the end of March, which is half of the year. And so it is very common for us to have a lot of storms passing through, and we have an understanding of essentially, the sort of normal prevailing winds we have during storms, and other storms that may have exceptional winds that are not from the normal area that we would have a storm come in from, and they are more concern for us. So we live with storms, and so we live with risk every day in the subtropics. Yeah, so as an arborist, talking to people about storms is my bread and butter. So what I would say is that with trees, we must always look for the positives. And we're looking for healthy response, and we're looking for environmental factors that act as protective factors. Yes, and so essentially, let's I want to go into the first couple of principles. So the first principle that I want to talk about today is the axiom of uniform stress. Was developed by Klaus Madik, and it was really about it's about mechanical stresses and on the tree, and whether or not a tree is under or overloaded, and the tree puts on reactive wood and response growth so that it optimizes its strength over time. And trees essentially have three dilemmas. They do not move, they do not talk, and then they have their own time. And so how they respond to different environments, different weather patterns, different events, is all in relation to tree time. And it's also connected with their resources and how much and the resources that they allocate towards response in their everyday decisions. And so trees are always making decisions about where to allocate their resources, which I'll discuss a little bit more about in regards to health. When I talk about health in a minute. And so one of the things that when I'm saying, it's a bit hard because I'm on Zoom, but normally like trees, the way that the trunk has grown, and you can see it in this picture, like how the trunk is in relation to the branches and how it's all well tapered. And so architecture is very, very important in regards to trees and their structure. And so you can see that that this tree here, this is a photo from Kew Gardens when I was there last year. And so you can see just how perfectly the tree has grown within that open, we would say an open paddock form, and just how the limbs taper off perfectly, and the bends in the limbs and the compression and tension wood are holding up those limbs, and all the weight is evenly distributed. And so so what Klaus Madik and Brewer said in their book was that the principle is that a tree is mechanically optimized, growing only sufficient wood for support and loading. And as a result, no area is underloaded to breaking point or overloaded with excess material. So what you see over time is where that a tree has altered its growing pattern because of the environment, or because of it's responding to an event that's happened, and it's lost some foliage, or it's lost a branch or something. And so over time, in its own time, trees will allocate different timber towards those areas so that it can ensure that the area in time has enough wood for loading. And so the other thing I like to look at is about, the taper and whether there's access end weight. So you can see in this, I'm not sure what species of tree this tree is, but I can see that there's an even distribution of foliage all along the limb. Like sometimes you'll have species. Figs can often have a lot of natural line tailing where the trees branches are like competing for and they're putting end weight. The foliage is at the end weight, and the way that the form is reflects that. That's one of the the cool things about fig trees. The next thing I want to talk about is genetic characteristics and the uniqueness of different species trees. So on this picture here, I've got that's a bark of a eucalypt, and that's a eucalyptus flower. It would be really great if you could put in the chat what your favorite, if you've got a favorite feature, if there's something about a particular species of tree that you really love, or if you have a particular tree and you just love that species of tree. That would be great. And I'll just have a little look at the chat. I know that I really love the foliage of the rowan tree in the UK, and there's really lots of fantastic trees. And oh yes, olive trees are fantastic. In Spain, I've seen some fantastic olive trees. And oh yeah, the UK has fantastic oak trees and the yew trees. I went to Northwest Wales last year and saw, I think it was 4,000 or 5,000-year-old yew tree in Northwest in the up near Anglesey, and that was really amazing. I couldn't believe that there was no signage or anything about the tree, but in some ways that may actually be good, because then there's less people coming around it and compacting it. And thank you. Thank you everyone for your contributions. Yeah, oak trees are great to climb, and thanks for that those articles. I haven't read that one by Duncan. I've read other things about the crossing limbs. Yeah, the branch attachment. That's really, it's fantastic, the work that he's been doing in Lancaster. So yeah, so there's all different, and the reason that I think I have started with the genetic characteristics in building like a story about the tree is because there's so many things that you might think is unusual about a tree, but it's completely normal for that characteristic and for that species of tree. And the other thing is when we take trees from their native and endemic growing environment and then we put them in the city, they change. Like they change the shape of their the foliage, the size of the foliage, the bark can change. There can be so many different things that happen in the city, and often when you recommend a species to somebody, you have to check out your references about you know, the size, because in its natural environment, it can be like really, really large. And yet as in a park or in your backyard, it can actually be quite stunted because of the change in soil types, the growing environment. It just responds differently. And then on top of that, you also have the differences in season, you know, even slight seasonal changes. The microclimate can change. There can be so many things that are different for a tree when it's brought out and from, you know, its forest, and that's just endemic trees, let alone trees that have been brought from. In Brisbane, we have a lot of poinciana trees. We have a lot of jacaranda trees. We have a lot of tababuia species of trees that are from South America. And so those trees really change and in an urban environment. And so we do trials on trees and just to see how they perform in the city, because you can look at something in a book and it can just be so wrong in how it performs in an urban environment. And the changes that happen with soil because of development, like even just making, like in Australia, when they're making new suburbs and they're doing slabs of concrete, and they will just, with a front end loader, will disperse a variety of soil types on one block of land. And so those soil types can respond differently. The trees can respond differently to those soil types. And yeah, it's really interesting to watch how trees change when they come into the city and their uniqueness. And let's go on to, what have we got? That was genetics. So I'm going to talk about, so this is a jacaranda here, actually, looking, it's about to lose its flowers. Its foliage, it's deciduous. And so you can see how the tree from the phototropism. So there's environmental characteristics that change the structure of a tree. And so on the private property, that alongside all the street trees in this street, there's a big overhang onto the footpath, and these jacarandas have really, really struggled. They've struggled in the shade of the other trees, and they've struggled for space. And so the branches, the trunk can be on a lean, the branches can change their form, and the foliage can change where it's growing completely. And it can be for its whole life that it grows and responds to that environment. The other thing is geotropism. So slopes with the earth and different grades that alter tree form and root form. And so you see compression and tension wood different in regards to the structure of the tree. And this can tell you quite a lot about the tree and how it's been impacted, and whether it's responding in time or whether the changes have actually impacted the tree, and the tree isn't coping well and is stressed because of those things. The last one is hydrotropism, water. And so roots will change their growth patterns depending upon the availability of the water, and whether or not, like, we don't have much root growth under the asphalt and under the curb and channel. The the tree roots may bust the curb and channel, but it's not because of water, it's just because they need the space to grow. And yeah, so the root pattern, we have a lot of exposed roots in the urban areas because we have a clay pan, and so as a result of that, the root plate is very, very shallow. It can be 600, maybe, I think that's probably about 2 feet in depth. Yes. And so next one. So wind is another thing that really impacts trees. And this photo here, I'll just go to show you this one. Oh, let's see where it is. No. Where is it? Oh, here it is. So this one I came across when I went to South Australia, and you can see that the whole root plate has lifted. It's really quite amazing. And there was a lot of trees where it was obvious a storm had gone through, and there was about 10 trees that were on leans. And eucalyptus trees are amazing because they have this sort of ribbing that happens in the bark as well. And so the trees haven't failed, but they haven't fallen over, but their root plates have lifted, and then they've adjusted for their with the soil, and so they somehow they have just kept on growing. And so those events that, well, that one event that moved them was not enough to push them over, but was obviously enough to do this damage. And the trees, because there's nothing around them, it's near a community nursery in a national park, there's no need to actually remove them or just let them be. There's no people around them passing underneath them or hiking or anything like that. So one of the things that in living in a city that has storms for 6 months, you become very aware of the weather predictions in regards to wind speeds. And what we've noticed is that wind tunnels have been created in the city where there's a large amount of huge skyrise business blocks. And so the wind goes in the place of least resistance. So the wind travels down the Brisbane River, and it travels and it takes shortcuts through the city, through the streets in between the large buildings, because the Brisbane city is actually like on a peninsula in the river, and the river snakes right around. So each of those corners become areas where the wind actually is faster, because the wind will cut the corner and take shortcuts. And so we've seen patterns in regards to trees coming over with particular wind speeds. And we've had some supercell storms where we've seen a lot of trees come over. And so observing all those trees after the storms is really interesting for looking at themes of different species, and how different trees, react. And some trees just are really strong and they just lose all of their foliage, and other trees are really shallow rooted. So we have lots of interesting discussions after those after those storm events. And so And also I wanted to just mention about pruning trees and how pruning trees really change the wind loading within the crown, and they can have a real it can really be detrimental to a tree when we over prune it, because it'll change how all the wind travels throughout the canopy, and so we've got two things that happen that are stressing the tree from the pruning. One is the loss of foliage and the ability to photosynthesize all the sugars, and so we have that loss of food. And then the second thing is the wounding, and that stressor and the loss of foliage and the branches means we have less dampening of the wind, so the wind can't travel down the tree. And I'm just having a little look at someone's comment about a Quercus palmeri, a scrub oak. That's something new that I wasn't aware about, that about the oak are well known for their association with subsidence on clay soil. So we don't have, we do have issues with clay soil, but we don't have them as extensive as you do in the UK. I've talked with different English arborist friends who have talked about it, because I have noticed that in your conferences that you have, there's always a presentation on subsidence to do with clay, and have friends that have had really old homes that have lost have had cracks in their foundations and had serious problems. But that isn't such an issue here. We do have droughts, and we do have heat stress, and we do have, because of those changes in soils under concrete slabs, we do have soil changes, but we don't have them to the extent that you do in the UK. So just going back to the pruning of the trees, the trees being over pruned can, impact the tree's health. It can actually be a lifelong thing. The tree in its own tree time may not respond. Now, one of the things that's really essential that's often not well planned in urban environments is the below ground area that's needed for a tree to live a healthy life and to have space for its root plates, for its root to really extend as it's needed for that species. So this here is a poinciana tree, and you can see how the tree's roots, it's perfectly normal that it has buttressing roots, and it does generally have exposed roots, but the form that this root tree has taken is obviously because as a result of the curb and channel, and sometimes, and it's very difficult to manage the trip hazards around that from a public safety perspective. And so often people don't walk on that side of the street, or they'll walk on the other side of the street, or take shortcuts, and so trees really need space. Their roots need space to grow. They need an adequate soil. There's formulas that help determine what different species need, and so that landscape architects can plan well, because that's what we find is that the concept plans look really, really good, and the idea of a particular species in a backyard may look good but in our mind, or but it may not be adequate. There may not be adequate space for that tree in that area, and it just may struggle for most of its life and just not thrive. The thing is, poor planning or keenness to plant more trees without taking into consideration the mature size of the tree may impact the tree's health and structure. I'm just going to go back to the other screen so I can just refer to my notes. Oh no, that's okay. So the other principle that I really wanted to talk about is in regards to health and the difference between vigor and vitality, and how this relates back to what I was talking about before with tree genetic characteristics. Because when you're wanting to read the story of a tree and really understand what's happening for a tree, it's not just the characteristics, it's the genetic characteristics, but it's about the vigor and vitality. So when I talk about vigor, I'm talking about the tree's species genetic response to stress. And so certain species have different ways of responding to stress. And so some trees really don't like being over pruned. Some trees have really sensitive roots. And if they are damaged, if only a small part of the roots are damaged, they can really go into a stress response. The other thing is wounding. Some trees really respond poorly to wounding. Our poinciana trees in Australia, we find that if you're doing, if that, a lot of them get hit by garbage trucks. And so when you have a large limb come down, that wound may never ever actually seal over, and it just may stay open. And that last front of the wound may actually create a cavity, which is fantastic for local wildlife. And so, yeah, so some of those things, it's really helpful to know those things about the species that you have in your local area and how they respond to different things. And you can just, so that you can understand, is that something that's unique to the tree that I'm looking at, or is there a theme, and paying attention to particular species in regards to their characteristics. And so the second thing is about the vitality. So the vitality refers to the resources available for the tree. And so the resources the tree's deciding all the time about where to allocate its resources. So the first thing that trees do is they focus on foliage, new foliage, they focus on new buds, they focus on new roots second, they focus on canopy, storing of sugars in it throughout the canopy, and stem storage, and well, thirdly, they focus on reproduction, and then diameter growth, and then the last thing that they focus on is actually defense. And so that was really quite surprising to me that they would do that. So that's often when trees are stressed, they may be allocating resources to, you know, the wounds from pruning, or they may have been impacted by footpath works, or they may have stress from compaction because they're completely surrounded by tiles or concrete or asphalt, and there's a lack of oxygen in the soil. And so all of those things can cause a tree to stress, and it will be deciding where to allocate its resources. And so another principle is that arborists talk about is the spiral of decline. And so it's been described by Danny Draper as a gradual tree deterioration and usually associated with repeated bouts of predation and stress. So there are points on the spiral where a tree can sort of stop going down in decline, and that can be when they are helped along the way by their owners and by their managers that look after the street trees, and that can be through health improvement. And so it's really important to understand when a tree does appear stressed, or when you think that maybe something has happened to the tree that is going to stress the tree. That can be a time for an intervention in regards to some way of looking at how to improve the tree's health so that the tree has time to recover from that stressor, because the decline happens when, you know, it's a continual series of events or environmental conditions that cause the tree to decline slowly over time, and it just doesn't have the time to actually recover from those stresses. Yes, there are lots of trees are an ongoing issue in regards to, there's just a comment there about roadside trees being a huge issue in Sheffield. Yeah, we have had poor planning as well, where trees really impact footpaths, and they're not wide enough for people with prams or people in wheelchairs to get through, and yeah, trip and slip hazards. So this, I'm going to go on to events that impact trees. So mechanical damage, I would say the garbage trucks I just spoke about before, that's one of the main impacts from a mechanical damage. And I'm not sure what you call them in the UK, whether they're whippersnippers, brush cutters, where you do around the edges, and so lawnmowers. So this little damage here in this picture on a root, that's just from a lawnmower, but it's been constant. Every time the person's mowing, they're just taking off a little bit more of the new cell growth, so the tree's always being knocked back. You can have pests and diseases that come as a consequence of you know, worldwide movement of timber. And so we have fire ants in Australia. We have myrtle rust, which has impacted the Myrtaceae whole family of eucalypts. That is causing havoc in the timber industry, but also for certain species of trees where the tree has to be completely removed. And I'm aware that you have Dutch elm disease, and there's a new disease for oaks in the UK. I've heard something about that more recently. And so those things can be environmental. With climate change, we're talking more about trees being vulnerable. We have animal damage. You probably have damage from deer. We have damage from feral deer here. It's very hard to grow in certain seedlings in certain areas. We get possums. Possums eat the new leaf tips. They love them. And what happens is each season by season, the tree gets knocked back. The possums eat the flowers. The possums eat the new shoots. And eventually the tree dies. Leaching of liquids. So I've seen, you know, people cleaning their cars, restaurants washing down with particular products, and the tree being, you know, having lots of different chemicals put around the base of it. Builders that think that concrete slurry is a sort of mulch. Those sort of impacts to trees, the soil, the foliage, the trunk, the branches. And so, yeah, windstorm events. I mentioned about those before. And the other one that's increasingly being talked about is heat waves and drought. So there's a lot of talk about climate resilience for different species and trialing species that come from a city that is 500 kilometers, so say about, I don't know, about 250 miles north. And so you would be going 250 miles south because it's the opposite hemisphere. So we are looking at the tree species that are being planted in the hotter towns and cities north of Brisbane, and also looking at, because we're really humid, but in the central part of the coast of our state, it's actually not humid, it's dry. And then in central Queensland and then north above that is tropical. And so it's really humid. So one of the things that really knocks trees about is humidity. And so, yeah, we've been trialing different species and also looking at the difference between some trees can handle a heat wave, but they can't handle the long drought, and or the opposite. And then we have events such as floods and fires. We've had a flood in 2011. We had another flood in 2000. During COVID, we had a flood, I think it was in 2021. And so we've had floods that have not necessarily been from rain. We've had floods that have been where the flood has happened north of us. And then as a consequence, the rivers have filled the dams and they haven't managed the dams in time. And so then the dam has had to be let opened, and those floods have come in, and that's what the flood that we had in 2011 was. So it actually flooded on a sunny day, which is quite surreal. So those having water around the feet, around the base of trees for hours and hours and days for species that are not accustomed to that can have long-term effects. You can physically have trees come over because of the force of the water. And then you can have the loss of oxygen in the soil can impact the tree health. And you may not see it at that time. You may see it in actually 10, 15 years, where a tree that you thought would live a lot longer, in fact, can't, doesn't have the longevity. And yes. Yeah, and so and I don't have fires around here, but I have been to areas that have really bad fires, and so some trees will recover and will spread seed from that, but many trees will just be burnt to the ground because of the type of fire being very, very hot. So there's where there hasn't been management of the fuel at the base of the trees, and there hasn't been controlled burns. We find that, yeah, they're different type of fire. So I'm just going to go on to what are some of the stresses, and I've been talking about some of them already. And so I talked about the wind tunnels and asphalt and concrete, poor soils, pollution. And let me just I just want to go Yeah, so I talked previously about how urbanisation changes soil conditions and movement of different soil types, machinery, people, animals, change environment, and overpopulation of certain animals. We have, yeah, I talked about the possums eating the new leaf growth and bush turkeys creating mounds. There's no natural predator for bush turkeys, although the babies do get eaten by local pythons. In Brisbane, it's quite common that people have snakes in their roofs. They say it's about every third or fourth house has a snake in their roof. And so we're at 1 hour. So what I want to do, we've basically talked about those things. And these are some of the things that indicate, a stressed tree. And often it can be a little thing, the stresses, you don't necessarily notice them at first. And finally, what I wanted to really emphasize with these arboriculture principles is about slowing down enough to observe and engage with the trees in your garden. Notice, what are your trees doing? Do the tree look healthy? How long have you known the tree for? Has anything changed? Can you see the principle of the axiom of uniform stress within the tree? Does something look like it's overloaded? Does there look like there's too much foliage on something? And just to continue to learn more about trees, and seek advice if there's anything that concerns you. And because as a tree keeper, you have a responsibility to maintain your trees and I guess provide your tree with a happy life by reducing its stresses. Yeah, and thank you for being here.